Hi! Today we are attempting to bring a static little hex world a little bit more to life. My name is T-Hands, and this is a series all about my solo game development process for Solaria, the minimalist solarpunk city builder where the city builds itself. We left off in the previous devlog at the end of July 2023. I'd decided on my game's aesthetic, I'd made some rough models to jazz things up a little, and I was feeling generally a lot more confident in my ability to, actually make this game. But one thing was still really worrying me, and that's the fact that a city builder kind of needs citizens. And other than a very brief foray into Unity's navmesh system for a failed game jam project a while back, I'd never done any kind of real navigation system at all. I was so clueless, in fact, that I didn't even know the words for what I needed to learn. And that sounds a bit silly, but honestly, building the vocabulary is a big part of learning anything new. You can't search effectively for answers if you're not using the same words as everybody else. Luckily, I have no shame whatsoever about being a learner, so I bleated for help on Mastodon, and the game dev community there was extremely helpful as always. They told me that most likely the solution I was looking for would be something called A*. They told me it's included in Godot and pointed me towards various resources, but most helpfully they sent me to this interactive guide from Red Blob Games, which I'm sure most people watching this are familiar with, but I'd never seen it before. It basically takes you through different grid-based pathfinding algorithms, the problems that they set out to solve, and explains them in an interactive way that just really helps the concept sink in. It was invaluable, absolutely required reading for anyone in that same situation. Of course, understanding the theory and actually implementing it, those are two very different things. Eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed that towards the end of the last devlog, citizens were already in. And yes, they were very broken, but they were there. In fact, I started trying to add citizens all the way back in June. As you can see, it went super well. The first task when implementing this pathfinding on a grid, it turns out, is planning. You need to figure out where your nodes and your edges are going to be before you can do anything else. Now for the uninitiated, nodes are basically your set waypoints. Maybe each square, or in this case hex, on your grid is a node, or maybe you only need a few of them. Edges are the connecting paths between each node, so again, maybe every node is connected to all of the surrounding ones, or maybe they're a bit more sparse. A lot of tutorials assume that each square or hex in your grid is a movement tile and will have a node in the middle. In my case, I like the idea of having my paths go around the outside of each hex tile like so, which means each hex has a node at all of these 6 points. I also wanted bridges connecting the hexes to always be in the exact center of a path, because I just thought that would be pretty. So now I potentially need a node in between those existing ones as well. This seems like a lot of nodes, but I've never done it before, so I honestly don't know if it is. I figured there's only one way to find out, and that is just to keep going and see if it works. One issue that I personally have in game dev is that I'm a very visual person, and I need to be able to see what's going on with my code. So I was really hoping that I could find a way to draw arbitrary lines in my Godot preview to show which connections my node was making, and make sure everything was properly joined up. Long story short, I could not for the life of me figure this out. If anybody has a recommendation for a tutorial or a built-in Godot thing or anything at all, I would be very grateful. As it was though, I was flying blind and I just had to keep making tweaks to my code and then running the game and seeing where the citizens went. If they went the long way around, I knew I'd somehow missed a connection somewhere, and if they said there was no route available, well, I knew I had definitely messed up. Eventually though, my first goal was achieved. Citizens spawn at newly built houses, and they take the shortest route to just this arbitrary corner of the hub tile here that I'd hard-coded as their first target for testing. Once they get there, they hang around for a second and then pick a random node within a certain distance and head off. The first few guys seemed a little bit drunk, and to be totally honest, I just fixed this through pure trial and error, just changing values in my code until it suddenly worked. Sometimes you've just got to twiddle with things and see what happens. Adding bridges, on the other hand, was pretty easy since I already had the coordinates of each node, and that was that for the absolute basics. For all this was a few months ago in real time, I am still so chuffed that I got this working. It was so different to anything I've done before. The lack of visualization options in Godot was a really big problem for me compared to Unity, but I persevered and I got there in the end. I'm really pleased with myself and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Then I posted this GIF and we all just sort of watched mesmerised for a bit. It was good times. It was also about this point in the project that I took an accidental 2-month break, which is just what happens sometimes when you have life to deal with and big planned trips and you're self-employed and oh my god, why do you keep taking on more projects? First task when I got back was to make those bridge connections more random. Having every hex connected to everything else on all sides? Pah, boring. The people demand more interesting routes. I think my approach to this is probably quite inefficient and I'll end up looking at it sooner rather than later, but here's pretty much what I did for now. The hub, as the centre of our city, automatically connects on all 6 sides. Building a tile next to the hub first sets that connection to the hub, and then looks at the other 5 available sides and picks a random assortment of them to turn into connection points. So when I build a new hex, it first builds a bridge to those existing connections, and then assuming there are still unconnected sides, it chooses a random assortment of those to turn into connection points, and so on and so forth. I did run into an issue with this where, through the power of randomness, none of these have been designated as connection points. So I just run a check to make sure the number of bridges we've built isn't 0, and if it is, essentially I choose one neighbour tile and just retroactively force it to connect. So every tile should have a valid path to every other tile, even if sometimes you do have to take the scenic route. Like with most things, I was figuring this out as I was building it, so the code is a little precarious and I will definitely end up refactoring at some point. But like we've said before, if it works, it works. Obviously, having all of the city's population just head for this one arbitrary junction and then go wandering is not the final functionality, but I needed a break. So it was time for the always exciting day-night cycle. Now, I have done this in Unity, again in that one abandoned game jam project that now I've loaded it up to grab footage I really want to revisit one day. Oops. But I wasn't really sure if there's a different approach in Godot. So as per usual, it was time for a tutorial. Or in this case, a sort of spaghetti love child of maybe 5 or 6 different tutorials and some random code I made up to get them working together. Prototyping, baby! So I've got a directional light in my scene, which is representing the sun. And the solution I've got working is changing the rotation, the colour, and the intensity of that sun every single frame. Then on top of that, it's using the same calculations but on 2 different colour ramps, one to set the colour of the background and one to set the colour of the UI. Leaving aside the actual colours I've used here, which are definitely not ideal, but I was just getting it to work, I feel like doing all of this every frame isn't really the best. It also results in this flickering issue with the shadows, which I've confirmed via the time-honoured investigative skill of commenting that line out, is definitely caused by the rotation of the sun. So yeah, there's a lot more work needed here, but there was one problem that eclipsed all others, which is that now our little people are stumbling around in the dark. Of course, the city will eventually light up at night, but as a stepping stone, I decided to give the citizens themselves little headlamps that would turn on automatically at dusk and off again after dawn. And this may seem like a pointless dead end, but it did bring something to my attention. The little capsule men, being capsules, don't really have a front and a back. But once I put the headlamps on, suddenly they did. And it turned out my existing movement code just had them sort of gliding around weirdly, never changing direction. So yay for headlamps, because A, they're super cute, and B, nobody is tripping off the edge of a hex in the dark, but also C, it got me to fix my crappy code and actually have them face in the direction they're moving. Alright, we've got citizens moving around and generally looking busy. We've got a janky but technically functional day-night cycle, but the world was definitely still missing a little bit of life, and so after all of this hard work, I looked at my list and I spotted some potentially low-hanging fruit. The task simply said, birds. That seems like a nice chill thing to add. I foresee no problems here. Yeah, so I grabbed a bird model from OpenGameArt for testing, I stuck it in the game, and apparently I failed somewhere because this is not a bird. Round 2, and now we have a bird, but it will not flap. The Blender model came with a perfectly fine flapping animation, and as far as I could tell, everything was set up right in Godot, so I was just getting increasingly frustrated. I tried hooking into the animation player's signals and I found they just weren't firing. I was absolutely stumped. I'd built a hex grid and a building system on top of it. I'd successfully implemented A-star pathfinding, and now I couldn't get this bird to flap? Are you kidding me? Honestly, I was so annoyed I just gave up and I went to bed. And now we come to the moral of this story, which is that you should really consider keeping Godot updated. Because the very next day, I decided to do exactly that. I'd been running on 4.0 point something, and I think everyone else was up to 4.1 point something by this point. But I'd just been putting it off because I'd never updated a Godot project before, and I didn't know how big a project that was going to be. To be honest though, it was seamless. There was literally no change when I fired it back up. Except, wouldn't you know it, that bird was flapping. It wasn't even me in the first place, it was just some kind of engine bug. So yeah, if you're coming up against something that makes absolutely no sense, there is the tiniest little chance that it might not be you at all and it might just be the engine being a fool. Of course, other times it very much is you, and with all of the stress, I'd kind of forgotten to write any sensible bird spawning logic. They would spawn off screen and very slowly fly towards the visible parts of the screen, so on game load there were no birds, but soon there were so many birds! Full disclosure, I was so annoyed with the birds that I just left this in for ages. You can even see it happening in the background of my last video. But, just so we're all up to date, I have now gone back and fixed it. It's all good. The fact that my speed variable seems to make absolutely no difference to their speed is a problem for another time. Now, in the time it took to get all of this world stuff working, I did continue to develop some of the underlying systems of the game. Added a proper building mode that toggles on and off, overcomplicated the algorithm behind the demand bars, all that sort of thing. And we haven't really touched on much gameplay-wise yet in these videos, but I promise we will soon. Unfortunately, before I could go much further, that first intro video went out and 4 days later, I came down with COVID. I came down with it bad. And all of my plans for the last 6 weeks of last year just went out of the window. I could barely do anything. I could barely cross-stitch for weeks. It was grim. And to be honest, now we're at the end of March and I'm still not 100%, so yeah. It is what it is, and on the bright side, it does mean these videos are getting ever closer to catching up to the project in real life, which will be a lot more interesting to watch, I think. Anyway, next time we'll talk about getting back into the groove, but also the trials and tribulations of a newbie trying to implement her first ever save load system, because, spoiler alert, it did not go well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you there. Bye!